I'm Rachelle Archer, and you're listening to The Artful Leader. Welcome to the final episode of Season 3 of The Artful Leader. Today, we'll be going full circle on a theme we started this season with, which is how artists leave their communities better than they found them. And this time we'll be zooming out on a global scale, showcasing how critical the role of the artist can be in transnational diplomacy and building a civil and empathic global culture. And I'm so honored to welcome today's guest, Simon Dev. He is a curator and educator and currently the executive director of CEC Arts Link. He co-curated the Crossing the Line Festival in New York City from 2008 to 2018. He was professor of practice and director of the School of Dance at Arizona State University. His previous position include a number of things, including the artistic director of Spring Dance in the Netherlands, the Yorkshire Dance Centre in the UK, the Arts Council in Great Britain, some wonderful stuff on BBC Radio, and mentoring professional artists, developing their creative practices. Welcome, Simon.
Rachelle, it's great to be here.
I'm so glad you joined me, and I was really excited when your team reached out about facilitating this conversation. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at CEC Arts Link.
It's hard to summarize, but essentially CEC Arts Link was set up to build links between cultures, between people in different countries, and Arts Link emerged as a way of working with artists to bridge those connections. So we have a long history of working in really the former Soviet Union and all the former Soviet republics, and in Eastern Mediterranean. So we have a huge network of what is now 38 plus countries that we work with. And we spend a long time trying to find artists who can really engage with communities and artists and organizations in the United States to build this level of connection and dialogue. I mean, for us, it's important there's a real conversation that happens. This is not an art residency where the artist disappears into a studio and emerges with a painting after 6 weeks. We really want artists who are going to be engaged and connected and in dialogue with their peers, with artists in the region, with artists in the neighborhood, but also with community. And that's why we talk about our focus on social practice, and I can explain that a bit more if it's helpful. It's just a candy word to talk about artists who work with people. So the connection with community is really crucial to their creative practice and their creative process, and involving people both in the creation, but also in the conception and the framing of the ideas is important.
Yes, all of that sounds so fascinating and exciting. I'm curious, what is alive for you as an organization right now?
Well, you can, I'm sure, imagine we're very exercised by Russia's war in Ukraine, and we are trying to find ways that we can support the creative community in Ukraine. Many artists have been displaced. Some have had to leave the country. Many have had their homes, their studios, their workspaces destroyed. So there's a huge level of trauma, but also displacement that we're helping artists to really both deal with, but also to start to think about working together for the future. So that's a big part of what we're doing at the moment. But we're also looking at work with a variety of communities across the US. We're concerned that the United States, especially my sense is since 2008 and the big economic crash, when funding for international exchange began to diminish, many foundations felt they needed to address domestic issues in the US, and that sending artists abroad or even curators abroad or presenters abroad was a kind of luxury that really needed to be reduced. It wasn't the icing on the cake, it was sort of seen as the cherry on the icing on the cake. And that cherry's been sliced and sliced and diced. So we're really looking at how we can advocate for a greater understanding of the value of transnational exchange, to connect artists to artists in different cultural contexts, in different geopolitical contexts, and in different economic contexts. It's important there's a dialogue, that there's a level of empathy that's built and a level of understanding. And of course, what that generates then in the communities in which both artists are living, whether it's in the US or in their home country abroad, is a connection that is human and personal, and I think starts to build a genuine level of empathy and understanding, and the value of the humanity of people abroad, people who can often be determined as, the other.
Right.
So I think that's a big issue that we are, in a sense, trying to address, but implicitly by connecting artists from different contexts and different countries. And we talk a lot about transnational exchange because we're increasingly feeling that political boundaries and borders are not so relevant to the way artists think about their work, and especially about the way people connect and communicate. It's about who is it and what is their interest, what are their values, what do we share, what is different, what can we exchange. So we talk a lot about transnational dialogue being the core of what we do, and we try and get away from this idea that it's sending artists abroad or they're traveling to enrich themselves. It's really none of that. It's about an urgent, I think, global need now to help communities understand each other, to connect with each other, and to build a sense of rapport. There are so many issues that confront all of us globally. It's not about nation states anymore. There's a big UN conference on the issues around the water shortage, which is in New York at the moment. And that's compounded by the climate change, and now increasingly hostilities between countries. So I think there's so many issues that the global community need to come together to address, that small ideas of national difference in a sense are not the things that we need to be concerned about. It's how do we build connection, how do we build a real sense of understanding between people. That's critical.
Yeah.
And artists, of course, can be a really powerful catalyst in making that happen.
Yeah, and you just jumped into where I was going to head with my next question, which is, how are artists uniquely suited to address these kinds of issues and build those connections that can be so transformative?
Yeah, well, of course, not all artists are. It doesn't apply to every creative being, and artists work in different ways. And for me, that's the value of having a diversity of artistic practices. But we specialize or focus on social practice. And as I said, that's really where artists are interested in connecting with people and in dialogue, determining what the issues are that face them as individuals, perhaps them as a community, and finding ways in which creatively they can jointly approach it, tackle it, build awareness of it, bring attention to it often. Because often it's a social issue that needs a kind of local government or public attention to solve, to address. Artists can be amazing at bringing attention to things and creating, platforming issues in communities. So it's that idea of social practice as a creative way of addressing community issues is what we focus on. And whilst that term, social practice, is kind of used a lot in the art world and in academia, and it's sort of known in the West. In many countries we're working with, in Central Europe, in Central Asia, it's not a term that's used, but many artists say, well, I'm a creative artist and I'm also an activist. And what they really mean is they are addressing social issues, social concerns within their artistic practice. But often they see them as separate, but we really see them as connected. and part of the same impulse to bring just a new way of looking at an issue. And you know, I think there are many things at play here, but I feel artists have become now a really powerful tool or connector. I shouldn't, maybe saying tool instrumentalizes them somewhat, but I don't see it as that. I think many artists are incredibly powerful at creating opportunities for community dialogue, you know, creating an open platform for a conversation. You know, it's not party political, it's not local government, it's not part of the existing administrative infrastructure. In a sense, it's an artist is a sort of neutral element in society, and I feel they can, for that reason, create an openness and a dialogue and an empathy with that actually no one else can. I often say artists are our last hope, but actually I think artists are really critical and important in the way we think about how we navigate our lives, how we connect with our neighbors, how we work with our communities, and that creative thinking, that just the challenging of ideas, that offering of other perspectives that artists can often bring, just asking us to reimagine something can be very powerful and very transformative.
And I'm just so touched hearing your story, because I played a role as an expressive arts therapist at a school for unhoused youth here in San Diego for 17 years or something. And my role was to do just that, was to connect with that community and find ways to elevate their voices and bring awareness to the community and tell a different story about that population. And so the idea of doing this on an international scale is just mind-blowing and so exciting. And I'm wondering if you could maybe take us down on the ground and give us some stories or an example of a project or something where this came to life.
Yeah, well, let me talk about one of our programs. So we have a range of programs, which is our way of framing the activities we're doing, and it's run by different members of the STEP team. But we have a program called Arts Link International Fellows. So in a nutshell, this is an open call to all the countries we work with, for people who are interested, who of course have a background in working creatively within community contexts, but people who are interested in connecting with a community or an arts organization in the US. And we offer a 3-phase process because we're interested not just in a one-off moment, but in really building a more sustainable relationship. So we do an open call, we have a peer panel review process, and we choose 10 artists each year. And we spend 6 weeks in the spring connecting them with a host organization. So we choose the artists first, and that's important. And then based on their research and their practice, we choose a host organization, or we invite an organization to see if they're interested. Some we know, some are often new because of the interests of the artist. And we ask them to spend 6 weeks essentially online. It's kind of an online residency, but it's about what we're doing now, chatting about practice, getting to know each other. But it's also then about saying, you should meet this person. Next week we'll have an open Zoom, and all our artists who work with us can be part of it, and you can share your practice, and we can see who's interested in connecting. So it's a way of trying to already connect an artist from a completely different place, maybe a country or a city that has no relationship to this US location. And they then spend 6 weeks online, and then they come in person in the fall also for 6 weeks. And they already hit the ground running because they have all these connections already, and they know who they want to talk to and who else they want to meet. And it's not about making a thing, it's really about building a kind of conversation. Some people make stuff, of course, artists always do, but that's not the reason. It's to really build a strong relationship. And then we ask them if they want to do a project. We resource them to do a project back home with an element from that US residency. So it's really about trying to build a sustainable creative relationship that we hope has a life beyond our intervention.
Mhm.
And a great example of this happened just 2 years ago. An artist called Bermet Borobeva, who's based in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, came to Chicago, to Hyde Park Art Center in the south of Chicago. Her concern was about the environment, but also about the way in which we generate waste and we don't process it, but also the community impacts of waste.
Mm.
In Bishkek, there's a city dump 2 miles outside the city, which, it's far enough away, no one in the city and certainly in the city government think about it at all. But there's a community of 3,000 people living around that dump and living off the dump, effectively, picking out things they can recycle or can they resell. But of course, the dump is constantly on fire. So it's producing this toxic fumes that are impacting the community. The kids have asthma, and of course, no one was interested because it was, 2 miles away from the city.
Right.
So Bermet in Bishkek created a festival called Trash Festival, and she brought artists to the dump, and she brought therefore press and journalists to the dump, and she created an attention on the environmental disaster that this dump was and the massive impact it was having on the community that were living around it. They took over a store, they got books that they found in the dump and others that were donated. They created a community library. So It was about giving attention to this community, but also helping the community to see there was a different way of being, in and around this context, but getting the city to also address it. She came to Chicago, where, of course, it was Halloween, and she was horrified that all the people were carving pumpkins and then leaving them to rot on their doorsteps, saying this is a huge waste of food. And she created a feast with carved pumpkins at Hyde Park Art Center, which she invited the community to come to, and they all had pumpkin jam and pies, and she made some curries and also savory, sweet, all kinds of things. Something I heard 28 dishes, but
wow.
I wasn't there, so I don't know if that report gets exaggerated in the telling, but she created this feast of pumpkin to say, look, you don't just let this rot. It's part of a way of thinking about, food justice and diminishing waste. She worked in Chicago with an artist called Melissa Potter, who's she works with tapestry and all kinds of ways of engaging people, getting people working collectively. And her following year festival, the Trash Festival, we helped to support. Melissa went from Chicago and worked with Bermet on developing the access and resources for the community around the dump and getting the city to start to ameliorate some of the environmental issues. So, she's thinking very creatively, but she's also trying to work with the infrastructure that is there and also trying to educate the community to understand what's dangerous, what isn't, how they can live their lives. So this is a kind of good example. And now I hope the festival will happen again, and there'll be other artists from the US there. So it's built a link between an artistic community in Chicago and Bishkek, which didn't exist before. People can talk about issues in Central Asia that they had never encountered before.
Yeah.
And she brought this kind of sense of activism and awareness to what we take for granted in the US, to get people to really rethink what they're doing with with their food and with their waste. So that it's a good example of talking about the value of this exchange, but also that it's an equitable one. It's not artists coming to the US to learn things. It's people going to the US to share, of course, to learn, but also to teach, and there's a great value in that level. Again, building a sense of empathy, but also a real understanding of each other's practice and each other's kind of cultural context.
Yeah. And I love that creating opportunities for artists from other countries to come and reflect back to us, some of the things that we're doing that are there could be other ways of doing it, with
No,
waste.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, that's,
Chicago doesn't have a smoldering dump, but it has other issues for sure.
yeah.
No,
So
that's good.
yeah.
And conversely, there was again, it's an artist who is in California, Farah Parapetian, who went from California to Tashkent, to Uzbekistan. She was very interested in the cotton industry because in Tashkent, it's a huge cotton growing country. And she'd read that almost 1 in 8 people were in some way involved in the cotton industry. Was interested in these relationships between, cotton and its exploitative history, both in the south of the US and in Uzbekistan. But she worked with the people in the cotton industry, curating songs and getting stories from people, but building this kind of knowledge of the cotton industry, which she then took back and presented back in the US in relationship to the way people have built survival strategies, but also it had become a part of a way of thinking about community building, about community practice. And so a very kind of powerful project.
Yeah, so cool and so fascinating. So I'm curious, how do you think that artists working here in the United States could be better supported? You were saying earlier about some of these policies that have like chopped this little cherry down to this little tiny nugget. Are there some other models that you're familiar with?
We're not even close to the icing, it's true.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's a massive conversation, but because I was brought up in England and I worked in Europe, where there is a completely different, I would say, civic relationship to culture. There's a public investment in culture and the arts that comes from, part of our taxes go into. I mean, of course, there's an investment in the military too, but if you took a small slice of the US's military budget and put it into culture, it could have a huge impact. And in the government, there's a culture minister. Often it's a portmanteau position, culture and sport or culture and communication, but at least there's a voice in governmental decisions and thinking about culture. And what that signals, of course, to everyone who is either happy or not to pay their taxes, is that culture is an important part of civil society.
Yeah.
Just as much as you have an education ministry and you have a transport ministry and you have maybe a ministry for whatever buildings and economics, there's also one for culture.
Yeah.
And I think that's a critical message that is about positioning culture as an important component. It's not about it becoming more crucial than anything else, but that it's there. We don't.
That it has a place. Yeah.
In the US, we don't have that. And when you think that, I always say in the US, there's no public investment in the arts, and then everyone says, no, we have a national endowment for the arts. But actually, the NEA in the US has a budget. It's less than 2 million. I think for next year, 2023, it's going to go just over 2 million. 200 million. I think it's going to go up to $203 million for the entire nation. Wow. And that, just to put it in perspective, that $200 million is the budget for the Paris Opera House on its own. It's the same budget. They get 100 million from the government and they raise, 100 million from box office and donations. But so what funds ballet and opera in Paris is the same budget for the entire public investment in the arts in the United States of America. So you can imagine it's kind of pitiful.
Yeah.
And I think that idea of shifting culture into something that was an important part of civil society is important, that there is public investment in culture and that there are I'm not saying governmental determinations around culture, but governmental appropriations or peer group panels to say where resources should go. And then you start to change, I feel, public perception of culture, not as entertainment or distraction or some kind of elitist, kind of reward, but something that is. And I have to say, working in the arts in Europe, you felt that responsibility. At Spring Dance, which is a big festival in the Netherlands, where we had 4-year funding agreements, a concept unheard of in the US.
Yeah.
So, and it was an agreement between the national government, the local government, and the city where we were based. So they collectively agreed on a 4-year funding package for a festival of dance and performance, which is fantastic. So then you can really plan. You raise other money, of course, but you know exactly what your core budget is and what you can start to plan to do. So it meant we could do long-term projects.
Yeah.
We could work with communities over time. We could plan commissions of artists who were working, 2 or 3 years in advance. And you can be a part of that conversation about what that work is and how you can play a role in it. Things like that, which are unheard of in the USA.
Yeah.
And what was great was we felt we needed to, in a sense, provide opportunities for everyone, which meant we did a lot of things for free. We did a lot of things in public spaces. We did a lot of things that involved community in performances, bringing community in dialogue with international artists, and all the things that you feel you need to do in order to engage a city and the population of the country. And I think that also changes your idea of what culture is. But I'm going on a bit here, but what I have is an idea for I feel artists should be embedded in communities, and we should find a way, even in the US model, to find ways in which artists could be really, given housing, or they're offered some of supportive systems, not all together. They often build artist housing and there's 20 artists in one building, but, imagine having an artist's apartment in each public housing development across the US, where that artist had a free accommodation, but in return for doing so many hours work with communities, running after school things, working with elderly groups. You imagine what could happen both for those communities, but also that artist then has a sustainable way of living and a roof over their head. And there's a way of, I think, working with culture and with artists that really needs a serious re-examination in the US.
I could not agree with you more. That I love your vision. That's such a powerful vision, because of everything you've described, just the way that artists can interact with communities, can build relationships, can create these really valuable places of reflecting on our practices, how we live, how we could live differently, how we can live in ways that are more peaceful and more inclusive and more mindful of the impacts and how they reverberate through our country and around the globe. And I love that vision of CEC Arts Link, really to create this global culture, because we have to work together. We're all on this planet and we're all impacted by what's going on globally. And I love that sort of trans-border, transnational vision of creating something much bigger to solve the issues that we're up against.
And I think, our role as that mediator is to make those things happen. So it means we need to be the ones who are dealing with changing visa issues, which of course change all the time, both in the US, but also in other countries, health insurance, all those kind of things that prevent artists doing this sort of in a sense independently. We can facilitate this level of exchange because we can take on that, what seems to be a burdensome administration process, and make it happen. So we're registered with the Department of State, with the State Department, so we can issue J1 exchange visas, which
Mm.
means we can enable, I mean, they're prioritized then in the US embassies in the countries where the artists are. They're not, so it streamlines that process. It means, of course, they can't work in the US, but we can resource them and ensure that all their needs are met when they're here. It makes it possible, and by offering these connections to US organizations, it means they can start to build relationships with artists that, again, they would not otherwise have a relationship with cities, with communities, you know, with countries, with cultural practices they would not otherwise have access to. And so, yeah, what we're doing in a sense is small, but we always say we're changing the world one artist at a time, and seeing each process, which can often be met, you know, heavily bureaucratic and cumbersome, but where you create this relationship, it's incredibly powerful. And we've had so many testimonies from artists who continue to be in touch with their host organizations or with artists they met or community members they've met, even traveling afterwards to each other's countries, to, you know, so there's a connection that I feel is clearly of value and meets a need. I just wish we could do it on a scale that had a greater level of you know, impact and could create more of a momentum. But we're doing what we can within the resources and the capacities we have. And that's, you know, as I said, since 2008, resources for international exchange have really diminished, have reduced. The NEA used to have an international department. They closed that in the mid-teens. So yeah, for us, it's a constant issue of how do we resource this and how do we grow it, because we feel, yeah, each year actually, as you know, there's increasing xenophobia in the US, there's increasing international geopolitical tensions. We feel the need is growing, it's not diminishing. So we're always trying to find ways in which we can enable more communities to connect with more artists, especially transnationally. I think it's really crucial.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's something, I mean, I have to say, as a European, I never understood the road movie, you know, the US road movie genre, until I went to Arizona, where I realized I needed to drive for 8 hours just to get to, you know, the next state. Then I understood why the road movie was such a genre. But this idea of from the US traveling abroad seems to still be, for many people, a leap too far. You know, when I was at Arizona State, we would have an intake of dance students every year, and I would ask the fresh students, I refuse to call them freshmen, but the fresh people, who had a passport, and it was incredible. Only a handful had a passport, and that was usually because they had relatives in Canada or in Mexico. The notion that part of being a citizen meant you needed to be able to engage with the planet, you know, the globe. Yeah, is not part of the psyche. Was not, and these are, you know, kids going into higher education. And I mean, I was only at Arizona 5 years, and you know, I went there to help them reinvent their curriculum model. But I really felt what could be crucial is to have at least 1 year of that 4-year BFA or 3-year MFA abroad. You know, that would change so much for all of them. And there was a few exchanges, and we got a few artists, a few students to travel, but I feel that, you know, a system that enabled artists or students to leave the country would be so transformative for the way America thinks about itself and for the future of society in the US. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's the US as I grew up in England, where I was desperate to, you know, for them to build the tunnel under the channel. And when it opened, I was so happy. I felt finally we're part of Europe,
Yeah.
But the US really has this tendency for kind of island mentality, kind of insularity, that everything is here. And it's true, there's so much here. It's vast and extraordinary. But it's one place.
Yeah.
And there are many more that people need to be both understanding, engaged, confronted by, all those things, which I feel about how each of us grows and how each of us is able to be a much more functioning, active member of civil society.
Yes. Yes. And I grew up in Europe as well. I lived in Holland and Belgium for many years, and I studied expressive arts in Switzerland. And so I'm very passionate about the impact that being part of a global community can have on how we approach problems, how we approach communities, how we look at our role in the world. And so I'm right there with you. As we wrap up our conversation, I'm wondering if you have something that you would like to leave our listener with. We have so many folks who listen who are arts educators and leaders of arts organizations and teachers and, folks who are engaging in the arts in all kinds of different ways. Is there something you would like to leave them with today?
I think just that plea that artists are such a kind of critical part of the way society evolves and is able to think about and address issues that confront us, individually, within community and across nations, that we always find ways to center artists in the work we do. And you imagine if every corporation had, resident artists who were there in order to really get the corporations to really reimagine themselves and to question and to confront. I feel artists would have a much more powerful and important, they have an important role, but I feel we would recognize their power. But also I think it would mean artists had better ways of living and probably could get health insurance, which is often the thing that they lack the most.
Yeah.
So it's just this idea of centering artists and giving them the value and finding ways in which they can play a role in everything we do, I think is really an important formula, if you like, for the way we might evolve as a human race.
Yes. Wow. Well, thank you, Simon, so much for bringing this whole transnational perspective to the Artful Leader and sharing a little bit about your organization. If folks want to engage with you or support you or follow on social media, where should they go?
I think the best thing is we're on Instagram, which you can find, at CEC Arts Link, but our website, which is cecartslink.org, has links to all the things I'm talking about, programs, and you can see photos of our gorgeous team also.
Fabulous. Yeah, so listener, go and check them out and support and think about how you can engage artists in your community. Thanks again, Simon. Have a wonderful day.
Rachelle, thank you so much for the invitation. Great to chat.
All right. Have a wonderful day.